to.
I know this isn't what you agreed to, but wherever I go, my mother goes. I didn't come here to count mouths. I came here to build a home.
Harsh winds battered Cheyenne's train depot as Emmett stared at his mail-order bride. She wasn't alone. Clutching her arm stood a frail, trembling, older woman. In brutal Wyoming territory, one extra mouth meant starvation. What Emmett never realized, however, was that his new family carried a dangerous, deadly secret. The wind howling off the Laramie Mountains tasted of grit and impending winter. Emmett Callahan stood on the wooden platform of the Cheyenne depot, his broad shoulders squared against the chill, his calloused hands shoved deep into the pockets of his canvas duster. At 32, Emmett was a man carved by the harshness of the Wyoming territory. He ran the Dust Creek Ranch alone, a sprawling but struggling piece of land that demanded more hours than the sun could provide. Loneliness had driven him to place an advertisement in a Chicago newspaper. Practicality had driven him to choose Clara Higgins from the dozens of desperate replies. For 6 months, their correspondence had been a lifeline. Clara's letters were written in a neat, elegant script, speaking of her desire for open spaces, hard work, and a quiet life. She never asked for poetry or grand promises. She only asked for a ticket west and a vow that he was a decent man. Emmett had wired his last $50 to secure her passage. The heavy chugging of the Union Pacific train shattered the quiet of the plains. Plumes of thick black smoke billowed into the pale sky as the locomotive screeched to a halting metallic groan against the station. Emmett's heart did a rare, anxious flutter against his ribs. He watched the passengers disembark: cattlemen, businessmen, gamblers, until he saw her. Clara Higgins was as striking as her photograph, though the journey had painted dark circles under her eyes and layered her faded blue bombazine dress in soot. Her dark hair was pinned back haphazardly, and her posture was rigid, with an exhaustion that went deeper than bones. But it wasn't Clara's weariness that caused Emmett's breath to catch. It was the woman beside her. Clara was practically carrying a frail, elderly woman. The older woman's face was a map of deep wrinkles, her trembling frame wrapped in a moth-eaten shawl that offered no real protection against the Wyoming wind. She leaned entirely on Clara, coughing a deep, rattling sound that seemed to echo across the empty platform. Emmett stepped forward, his boots heavy on the wooden planks. "Clara?" he asked, his voice low and steady, masking the sudden storm of confusion in his mind. Clara's head snapped up. Her eyes, a striking, desperate shade of hazel, met his. She swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the old woman. "Mr. Callahan, I am Clara." Emmett removed his Stetson, nodding respectfully, though his gaze remained fixed on the elderly woman. "You didn't mention a traveling companion in your letters." The silence that stretched between them was heavier than the iron of the train. Clara stood taller, a fierce, almost dangerous protectiveness radiating from her small frame. "This is my mother, Martha Higgins. I know what our arrangement was, Mr. Callahan. I know I promised you a wife who could work from dawn till dusk, and I will. I will work the fields. I will mend the fences. I will bleed for your ranch. But I could not leave her in Chicago. The poorhouse would have killed her in a week." Clara took a shuddering breath, her chin trembling before she locked her jaw. "If you turn us away, I will understand. I will find work in town to pay you back for the train ticket. But where I go, my mother goes." Emmett stared at the two women. In 1883 Wyoming, survival was a razor's edge. Winter was coming, and his larder was already meager. He had barely enough flour, salted pork, and coffee to sustain himself and a new wife. An elderly, sickly woman wasn't just an inconvenience. She was a severe liability. It was a cold, mathematical truth of the frontier. He looked at Martha. The old woman looked back at him with milky, unapologetic eyes. "I don't eat much, Mr. Callahan," she rasped, her voice sounding like dry leaves over stone. "And I know how to mend a shirt better than any tailor in the city." Emmett looked back to Clara. He saw the sheer terror hiding just beneath her defiant glare. She was a woman backed against a wall, expecting the worst from a world that had clearly given her nothing else. He thought of his own mother, buried on the ridge overlooking Dust Creek, and the promise he had made to be a man of honor. Emmett placed his hat back on his head and reached for Clara's heavy leather trunk. "The wagon is out front," he said simply. Clara blinked, stunned. "Mr. Callahan?" "The name is Emmett," he said, hefting the trunk onto his broad shoulder. He turned back, meeting Clara's tear-filled eyes. "And my home has room for both. Let's get your mother out of this wind." The ride to Dust Creek was a grueling 4-hour trek across rolling plains of sagebrush and yellowed grass. Emmett drove the team of mules in silence, giving Clara and Martha the back of the wagon, which he had lined with hay and heavy wool blankets. Throughout the journey, Emmett noticed something peculiar. Every time the wagon hit a rut, or a hawk shrieked overhead, Clara flinched. More telling, however, was how she constantly twisted her body to look behind them, her eyes scanning the empty, endless horizon leading back toward the railroad tracks. It wasn't the look of a woman marveling at the vast western landscape. It was the look of a woman who expected the devil to come riding over the nearest ridge. The transition to life at Dust Creek was both a blessing and a grueling trial. Emmett's cabin was a modest, 2-room structure built of sturdy pine and chinking. It was warm, but it was small. The first night, Emmett dragged his bedroll out to the barn, insisting that Clara take the cot by the stove and Martha take the main bed. Despite Clara's fervent protests, Emmett's stubbornness won out. It was a silent testament to his character, one that did not go unnoticed by either woman. True to her word, Clara worked like a woman possessed. By the time Emmett woke at dawn, the smell of fresh biscuits and chicory coffee already filled the crisp morning air. She scrubbed the wooden floors until her knuckles bled, helped haul water from the creek, and even took to learning how to handle the livestock with a fearless determination. She was trying to prove her worth, trying to justify the space she and her mother took up. A quiet, slow-burning romance began to take root in the harsh Wyoming soil. It wasn't born of poetic declarations, but of shared labor and silent understandings. It was the way Emmett would quietly leave a bucket of warm water by the door for Clara to wash her aching hands after a day of chores. It was the way Clara would mend the tear in Emmett's jacket, lingering just a second longer than necessary when she handed it back to him. When their eyes met over the dinner table, the harshness of the frontier seemed to melt away, leaving only a profound, magnetic pull between a solitary man and a desperate woman. But Martha, despite her frailty, was sharp. Sitting by the hearth with her knitting needles clacking, she watched the two of them. One evening, while Emmett was out securing the barn, Martha reached out and grabbed Clara's wrist with surprising strength. "He is a good man, Clara," Martha whispered, her voice tight with a rattling cough. "Better than we deserve. Better than we've known." "I know, Mama," Clara replied softly, looking toward the heavy oak door. "Then you cannot let him be destroyed by our ghosts," Martha warned, her milky eyes flashing with intensity. "If Josiah's men find us, they will kill this boy. You must tell him the truth." Clara pulled her hand away, her face pale in the firelight. "We are 1,000 miles from Chicago. Josiah Caldwell doesn't care about us anymore. We are safe here." But even as she said the words, her voice trembled. The illusion of safety shattered 3 days later. Emmett had ridden into the town of Cheyenne for a final supply run before the first heavy snow. He stopped at the assayer's office, then the general store, loading up on 50 pounds of flour, salt, and medical tonics for Martha, draining the last of his meager savings. Before leaving, he stopped by the sheriff's office to drop off a requested bundle of tanned hides. Sheriff Bo Miller, a grizzled lawman with a missing thumb and a perpetual scowl, was poring over a stack of telegrams on his desk. "Callahan," Bo greeted, gesturing to a pot of tar-black coffee. "Help yourself. How's the new bride settling in?" "She's fine, Bo. Works hard," Emmett said, taking a tin cup. Bo leaned back, his chair groaning. "Glad to hear it. Folks around here could use some peace. God knows the trains keep bringing trouble. Had a Pinkerton man through here yesterday. Nasty piece of work. Fella by the name of Arthur Briggs." Emmett took a sip of the bitter coffee, his expression neutral. "Bounty hunter?" "Worse. Corporate muscle," Bo spat, tapping a telegram. "Works for a syndicate back in Chicago, run by a ruthless son of a gun named Josiah Caldwell. This Briggs is looking for 2 women who skipped town owing Caldwell a fortune. $5,000 to be exact. Says it's a debt of blood." Emmett's hand tightened around the tin cup, the metal bending slightly under his grip. 2 women? "Yeah. An older woman and her daughter. fled under fake names, supposedly. Briggs is tearing up every ranch from here to Laramie, looking for him. Offered a $500 reward for information. You keep your rifle loaded out at Dust Creek, Emmett. Men like Briggs don't care who gets caught in the crossfire. Emmett's blood turned to ice. He didn't stay to finish his coffee. He drove the wagon back to the ranch at a breakneck pace, the mules foaming at the mouth by the time they reached the property line. When he arrived, Clara was out by the creek, wrestling with wet laundry. Martha was asleep in the cabin. Emmett walked straight past the barn and into the house. He felt a sickening sense of betrayal gnawing at his gut. He went to Clara's heavy leather trunk at the foot of her cot. He had never touched her belongings, respecting her privacy, but survival dictated otherwise now. He unlatched the brass fittings and dug beneath the layers of folded bombazine and cotton. At the very bottom, hidden inside a hollowed-out piece of sewing wood, he found a bundle of letters tied with a red ribbon. Emmett unfolded the crisp parchment. The letterhead belonged to Caldwell Imports and Loans, Chicago, Illinois. The words scrawled on the page were violently clear. Miss Higgins, your late father's debts are not forgiven by the grave. You owe this firm $5,000. If you do not report to my establishment to begin working off this debt, my men will find you. And when they do, your crippled mother will be thrown into the Chicago River, and you will learn what true debt feels like. Josiah Caldwell. Emmett stood frozen, the paper crinkling in his large hand. He hadn't just married a mail-order bride. He had harbored a fugitive from one of the most dangerous criminal outfits in the East. The cabin door creaked open. Clara stood in the threshold, a basket of wet clothes propped on her hip. She took one look at Emmett, then at the letters in his hand. The color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a ghost. The laundry basket slipped from her grasp, tumbling to the floor. "Emmett," she whispered, her voice breaking. $5,000, Clara? Emmett's voice was dangerously low, a storm brewing beneath the quiet exterior. You brought a Chicago enforcer to my doorstep? Tears spilled over Clara's eyelashes. She didn't run. She didn't cower. She stepped into the room and closed the door behind her, locking eyes with the man she was falling in love with. My father was a gambling addict, Clara cried, her voice raw with a decade of suppressed agony. He borrowed money from Caldwell and died before paying a cent. Caldwell didn't want the money, Emmett. He wanted me. He wanted to force me into his brothels, to pay it off on my back. I couldn't let my mother see that. I couldn't. She fell to her knees, burying her face in her hands. I am so sorry. I'll pack our things. We will walk into the plains tonight. I won't let his men hurt you. Emmett looked down at the weeping woman. He looked at the letters, then tossed them into the roaring fireplace. He watched the name Josiah Caldwell curl and burn into black ash. The betrayal stung, but the thought of Clara being dragged back to a life of degradation ignited a fierce, primal rage within him. He walked over to the fireplace, reaching up to the mantel. He pulled down his heavy Spencer repeating rifle and the box of brass cartridges. Get up, Clara, Emmett commanded, his voice cold as steel. Clara looked up, her tear-streaked face trembling. Emmett, please, I'll leave. I said get up, Emmett repeated, racking the lever of the rifle with a loud metallic clack. I told you at the station that my home had room for both of you. I didn't say it was going to be easy. He walked past her, his eyes fixed on the horizon outside the window. But if this Arthur Briggs comes onto Dust Creek looking to collect, he's going to find out that Wyoming men collect their own debts. In lead. The metallic clack of Emmett's repeating rifle seemed to echo in the small cabin long after the sound had faded. Clara stared at him, her chest heaving, unable to comprehend the sheer, stubborn grit of the man standing before her. He was not turning them over. He was preparing for war. Before Clara could utter another word of apology, a dry, rattling cough broke the heavy silence. Martha emerged from the bedroom, leaning heavily against the doorframe. She looked weaker than usual, her skin the color of old parchment, but her eyes burned with a fierce, lucid fire. It is not just the $5,000, Mr. Callahan, Martha rasped, her voice trembling but resolute. Josiah Caldwell would never send a high-priced Pinkerton man across the country for a mere gambling debt. A man like that writes off small losses. He does not chase them to Wyoming. Emmett lowered the barrel of his rifle, his brow furrowing deep into his forehead. Then what is he chasing, Mrs. Higgins? Martha slowly reached into the bodice of her heavy woolen dress. Her frail, shaking fingers produced a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn and stained. She walked forward and placed it on the rough-hewn pine table. When Josiah's men came to ransack our apartment after my husband died, they were careless, Martha explained, leaning against the table for support. I was a seamstress for some of the wealthiest women in Chicago, including the wives of city officials. I knew things. I saw things. When Josiah's brute of an enforcer dropped his coat, this fell from his inner pocket. I hid it before he noticed. Emmett stepped closer, opening the book. The pages were filled with columns of names, dates, and staggering sums of money. Beside the numbers were notes regarding illicit shipments of liquor, extortion rackets, and bribes paid to high-ranking municipal authorities. "This is Caldwell's shadow ledger," Martha continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It outlines every bribe he has paid to the Chicago police captains and city aldermen. There is a name in there, Alderman Francis Sullivan. If this book were to fall into the hands of a federal judge, Sullivan would hang, and Caldwell's entire empire would collapse in a day. That is why Arthur Briggs is hunting us. Caldwell isn't trying to collect a debt. He is trying to silence a threat." Emmett stared at the ledger, the magnitude of the situation washing over him. This was no longer a simple matter of a runaway bride and a vindictive loan shark. This was a syndicate war that had followed them to the absolute edge of the frontier. "You brought a powder keg into my home," Emmett said quietly, running a calloused hand over his jaw. "I am sorry," Clara wept, stepping forward to touch his arm. "I didn't know about the book. She didn't tell me until we were on the train. Emmett, please, saddle your fastest horse and ride to Cheyenne. Leave us here. You owe us nothing." Emmett looked down at Clara's hand, resting on his arm. Her fingers were bruised and rough from working his land, from bleeding for his ranch, just as she had promised. He looked at the quiet desperation in her hazel eyes, a desperation he had spent the last 3 weeks falling in love with. "I made a vow at the train station," Emmett said, his voice steadying into an unbreakable resolve. "I don't break my word, and I don't run." Emmett moved with a sudden, terrifying efficiency. He ordered Clara to fill every bucket and basin with water from the creek, knowing that men like Briggs often favored fire to flush out a barricaded target. He dragged the heavy oak dining table against the front door and nailed the heavy wooden shutters over the glass windows, leaving only a small gap for his rifle barrel. He handed Clara a loaded, double-barreled scattergun, showing her how to brace it against her shoulder. "If they get past me, you don't hesitate," Emmett instructed, looking deep into her eyes. "You pull both triggers." The sky outside turned a bruised, violent purple. The first snow of the Wyoming winter began to fall, drifting down in thick, heavy flakes that quickly blanketed the sagebrush in absolute white. The temperature plummeted, freezing the mud in the yard into jagged ridges. They waited. The ticking of the mantel clock sounded like a judge's gavel in the silent cabin. At dusk, the dogs in the barn began to bark frantically. Emmett positioned himself by the window, peering through the narrow slit between the shutters. 4 riders emerged from the tree line, their dark coats contrasting sharply against the pristine white snow. Leading them was a man who looked entirely out of place in the Wild West. He wore a tailored suit, a heavy wool overcoat, and a black bowler hat. Arthur Briggs. Flanking him were 3 rough-looking men, local hired guns drawn by the promise of Caldwell's bounty money. Briggs halted his horse 30 yards from the cabin porch. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply pulled a silver flask from his coat, took a slow drink, and shouted toward the house. "Mr. Callahan." Briggs's voice was cultured, carrying an unsettlingly calm cadence over the howling wind. "My name is Arthur Briggs. I represent a business interest in Chicago. You are harboring stolen property, 2 women, and a very important leather book. Send them out, and I will compensate you for your trouble. $1,000 for your inconvenience." Emmett slipped the barrel of his Spencer rifle through the shutter gap. "You're trespassing, Briggs. Turn your horses around, or you'll be leaving Dust Creek in a pine box." Briggs chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He motioned to the 3 armed men beside him. "You are a dirt-poor rancher, Callahan. You are outmanned and outgunned. I am not leaving without Caldwell's ledger. If you force my hand, I will burn this cabin to the ground and pick the book from your charred remains. Then come and try, Emmett growled softly to himself. Briggs didn't hesitate. He gave a sharp nod. The 3 local hired guns spurred their horses forward, drawing their 6-shooters and firing a hail of lead into the front of the cabin. Bullets tore through the thin pine siding, shattering pottery and sending splinters flying through the dim room. Clara screamed, dropping to the floor and pulling her mother down beneath the protective cover of the cast-iron stove. Emmett didn't flinch. He tracked the lead rider through his iron sights, took a slow breath, and squeezed the trigger. The heavy, 5.6 caliber slug caught the rider in the chest, throwing him backward out of his saddle. The man's horse neighed in terror, bolting into the snowy plains. The remaining 2 thugs scrambled off their horses, taking cover behind the heavy wooden water trough in the yard. Briggs had already dismounted and vanished into the swirling snow, flanking the house. "Clara, watch the back door!" Emmett shouted over the deafening crack of gunfire. Clara scrambled on her hands and knees, hauling the heavy shotgun toward the kitchen. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had never fired a weapon in her life, but the thought of Caldwell's men taking her mother fueled a primal, blinding courage. Outside, the 2 men behind the trough laid down a suppressing fire, keeping Emmett pinned at the window. Suddenly, the distinct smell of kerosene drifted into the cabin. "They're trying to light the roof!" Emmett yelled. He abandoned the window, moving toward the front door. He shoved the oak table aside with a grunt of exertion, threw open the heavy latch, and kicked the door open. He stepped onto the porch into the freezing squall, firing his repeater from the hip. He caught the second thug in the shoulder just as the man struck a match. The man collapsed in the snow, screaming in agony. But it was a trap. From the corner of the porch, stepping out from the shadows of the eaves, was Arthur Briggs. He held a Colt Peacemaker leveled directly at Emmett's chest. "A valiant effort, Cowboy," Briggs sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before Emmett could swing his heavy rifle around, the thunderous boom of a shotgun roared from inside the cabin. Clara had abandoned the back door, rushing into the parlor. She fired the scattergun through the open doorway. She missed Briggs, but the blast of buckshot shredded the wooden post right beside his head, showering him in blinding splinters. Briggs staggered backward, cursing as he wiped blood from his eyes. He fired a wild shot that grazed Emmett's ribs, tearing through his duster and searing his flesh. Emmett grunted, dropping to one knee as the pain ignited his side. Briggs recovered his vision, aiming his revolver down at the wounded rancher. "I'm going to enjoy killing you, Callahan." "Look behind you, Mr. Briggs," a frail voice commanded. Briggs scoffed, not taking his eyes off Emmett. "I don't fall for parlor tricks." Click. The unmistakable sound of a hammer cocking back sounded inches from Briggs's spine. Briggs froze. He slowly turned his head. Standing in the doorway, trembling violently but holding a tiny silver double-barreled Derringer pistol, was Martha Higgins. The old woman's eyes were cold, devoid of any mercy. She had survived the slums of Chicago, the death of her husband, and a grueling trek across the country. She was not going to let this suited monster kill the man who had given her daughter a home. "You should have left us to the poorhouse," Martha whispered. She pulled the trigger. The small caliber bullet struck Briggs squarely in the side. It wasn't a fatal shot, but the agonizing shock of it dropped the Pinkerton man to his knees in the blood-stained snow. He gasped, dropping his revolver. Emmett didn't waste a second. He lunged forward, grabbing Briggs by his tailored collar, and drove a vicious right hook into the man's jaw, knocking him unconscious instantly. The winter wind howled across Dust Creek, suddenly the only sound left in the world. Emmett stood up, clutching his bleeding side. He looked at the bodies in the yard, then turned back to the cabin. Clara dropped the shotgun, tears streaming down her face, and ran to him. She threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his chest. Emmett wrapped his large, calloused hands around her, holding her tighter than he had ever held anything in his life. 3 days later, after the storm broke and Emmett's wound was bandaged, they did not bury the ledger. Instead, Emmett drove the wagon into Cheyenne, dragging a hog-tied Arthur Briggs into the sheriff's office. But Emmett didn't stop there. Guided by the undeniable proof in Martha's ledger, Sheriff Miller contacted the federal authorities. Emmett and Clara personally delivered the Black Book to the chambers of United States District Judge John A. Reiner. The historical fallout was unprecedented. Armed with the ledger, Judge Reiner bypassed local corruption and issued federal warrants. Within a month, Josiah Caldwell was arrested in Chicago by federal marshals, his empire dismantled, and Alderman Francis Sullivan was indicted for rampant corruption and extortion. The headlines splashed across newspapers from the East Coast to the Rockies. The formidable syndicate had been brought down by an elderly seamstress and a stubborn Wyoming rancher. Arthur Briggs was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison for attempted murder. The bounty on Clara and Martha was dead and buried. When spring finally broke across the Wyoming territory, melting the snow and turning the plains a vibrant emerald green, Dust Creek Ranch looked different. It was no longer a place of lonely desperation. Emmett stood on the porch, a cup of chicory coffee in his hand, watching Clara hang laundry in the warm morning sun. Martha sat in a rocking chair nearby, a thick quilt over her lap, knitting a tiny, soft blanket. Clara was pregnant. Clara paused her work, turning to look at Emmett. She smiled, a radiant, fearless expression that completely transformed her face. Emmett smiled back. He had sent away for a mail-order bride just to survive the winter. What he received was a family that taught him how to truly live. The home he had built had room for all of them, and for the first time, it was filled with peace. What a breathtaking story of courage, sacrifice, and frontier justice. Emmett and Clara proved that true love is forged in the fires of adversity, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones society overlooks, like a frail mother holding the key to bringing down a criminal empire. If you were captivated by this incredible real-life Western drama, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable historical tales.